I want to bring in someone who I've known pretty much my whole life. Our fathers were friends for half a century. Michael Bromowitz. I also was colleagues with him. He was a Washington Post reporter and has done a lot of great work in the private sector and has been for some time now the head of the Voice of America, an institution that has spread the gospel of America around the world for quite some time, and now is under a review by DOJ and faces extremely broad cuts in what they do. So here is my friend, I will say, Micah Bromwitz, who is much in the news these days. Mike, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Of course, it's fantastic to be here, Mark. I'm really honored.
All right. So tell people who don't know, let's just start VOA 101. What does Voice of America do, and why has it been targeted, in your view, by the Trump administration for big cuts?
Okay, so Voice of America, we've been around for 83 years. We started off as a radio broadcaster that broadcasts information about the war in America, behind Nazi lines during World War II. We became a television broadcaster. Now, increasingly, we are a global digital platform. We have about 360 million uh, either viewers, listeners, people who engage with us on social media. We publish in 49 different languages. We're really a very significant news operation. It's important to say we don't broadcast in the United States. We're prohibited by law from broadcasting in the United States. And really, our most important markets today are countries like China, Iran, Venezuela, Africa. And really, our mission, to put it bluntly, is to kind of tell the story about America uh, to the world and to tell it in a factually balanced way. That actually is in the VOA charter, and that is what our roughly 1,400 journalists try to do every day.
Are you still the head of Voice of America?
I think on paper, I'm still the head of Voice of America. What happened is that the president had an executive order. Well, first of all, let me just back up for a second. So the president announced in December that he wanted Carrie Lake to become the head of Voice of America. Certain things have to happen legally for her to be installed. I've sort of made it clear that I see myself as a caretaker. I'm happy to, be helpful to her as she takes on these responsibilities. That's a genuine thing, Mark. You know me. I've worked in with R's and D's my whole entire life, and that's important to me. I really want to be cooperative with her. Carrie Lake is now what's called a senior advisor to the acting CEO of U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is our parent company or parent organization. And essentially, the president has ordered USAGM, which includes Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, what some of you know, Radio Free Asia, a number of other entities. They've ordered the 7 agencies, including U.S. Agency for Global Media, to come back within 7 days with a plan for substantial reductions uh, to really eliminate all what's quote unquote non-statutory functions of this agency. And that's honestly a little bit hard to know what exactly is meant by that. But the bottom line is that they put 1,300 employees, including myself,
You have
on
salmon?
administrative leave.
You have mac and cheese?
And
Oh,
and
this is just, is this eaten already? No
Hold
one.
on. Hold on there a
and
second. Somebody's mic is open. We'll solve that. Go ahead.
okay. Okay. Anyway, they put 1,300 of us on administrative leave. Actually, this weekend, they terminated the contracts of about 500 journalists who work for us. So, really, the question I would say neutrally is, will VOA survive this? Will it be a smaller organization with maybe a slightly different mission? Will it go out of business entirely? And honestly, I've been asked that question by other media today. And the truth is, I don't know because I don't really know what's in the president's mind. I don't know what's in Carrie Lake's mind.
How big is the budget of Voice of America? And as someone who's very familiar with your operations, could it stand to be cut from where it is now?
Right. Our budget is roughly $270 million. I would say for the last 2 years, even before President Trump came into office, we have been cutting the budget, streamlining. My general view is that VOA can clearly be reformed. I mean, we are in a completely, as you know, Mark, a different media environment than when VOA was really prospered during the Cold War. I think, whereas during the Cold War, our problems were, how to get information behind the Iron Curtain. Today, it's how to combat propaganda, disinformation, misinformation. I don't know what the right word is, but basically, the problem that I think needs to be solved, whether you have a VOA or not, is our national security rivals like China, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, they are flooding the zone with lots of false information. And VOA has traditionally been a very important source of really truly non-biased, objective, accurate news and information for people living in these other countries. I still think that's a very valuable mission. Could it be rethought, reimagined, streamlined, modernized? Absolutely. Should we throw it out entirely? No.
So these other countries you mentioned, China, Iran, they have state media that creates
Yes.
lots of content both for the home audience and around the world. It seems like some part of the MAGA movement would like the function of providing counter information that's reflects the American point of view to be done by the private sector. What are the chances if VOA is eliminated or scaled back to near nothing that the private sector would pump language appropriate messages into, say, China and Iran?
Right. Well, I think there are two issues. I think that's a good question. I think that there are private sector organizations that exist now that are trying to get information into these countries. So, for instance, there's something called the Iran International, which I believe is funded by the Saudis or one of the Middle East, which has a very active program on Iran, which is sort of comparable, in size, I think, to VOA, maybe even a little bit bigger. They have more money than VOA, Persian network. In China, you've got private people, the New York Times, other people trying to get into China. I think number one, I'm skeptical of the business model for a private sector kind of VOA, if you imagine, and I think so. I'm not sure it's possible. Maybe someone smarter than I can think of that business model, but I also think the newsroom of VOA is extremely unusual because it's people from these countries who speak the local languages, who know the local markets really much better than, say, like someone from CNN or someone from Fox. It's just a different entity. It's a very unique news service, and it's taken 83 years to build it up. And I'm call me a little bit skeptical that it could be built up. Not saying things can't be done differently, but I just think that's a very unique quality of VOA, that sort of news service. And we really have really fine journalists, by the way.
So, as you know, one of the ways that Doge has operated is, and the administration is to find the weak links, to find aspects of programs that they say prove that it's not worthy of the taxpayers' money. And in some cases, that means things that they find to be left leaning or woke. I just got texted a headline which purports to be from a VOA story. I'm sure you've seen this already. Headline is, "What is white privilege and whom does it help?" I don't know if that's a real headline or not. I suspect it is, but is VOA too woke? Is it too much like National Public Radio or something else liberal that the administration doesn't want to fund because your journalists are, like many journalists in Washington, liberal?
Right. Well, let me say, I think one thing that's important to understand about VOA is that it's not like one newsroom. Okay. When VOA started, there was a giant kind of English language newsroom, which is basically made up of Americans. And then that news service content was translated by other people to go to the world. Today, that English language newsroom is much smaller and really kind of much more marginal to the size of to the mission of VOA. Honestly, I would have substantially cut, even eliminated the English language news center and really pushed the resources into Iran, into China, into Russia, into Latin America, into Africa. You know what and really created a smaller, more nimble desk to cover America. I think that, honestly, if you're talking politically, the biggest things that people have taken a shot at with VOA are typically what's produced by the English language news center. We get, to be honest, most people on the Hill, both Republican and Democrats, don't pay that much attention to VOA. But to the extent that they do, they get mad at a headline, like you mentioned, which is not appropriate. Actually, let me say, I don't know the headline. I'm not going to speak to an individual thing, but let me just say there are things that I've seen that I would not agree with. But I think you have to understand that there's just hundreds of stories and videos that are going out every day. There's actually no possible way that me or Carrie Lake is going to know everything that goes out. One thing that's very interesting about VOA is that we have each language service undergo a review every year for bias, fairness, etc. And that, finds that I think we do pretty well relative to the mainstream press. Are we perfect? No. But I think that if I were to say there's a kind of bias within the newsroom, it's like a pro-freedom bias. It's an anti-totalitarian bias. We've got these incredible journalists who were like kicked out of Russia, kicked out of China, who can't practice free press where they are, and they've come to America and they are trying to report on America for the people that they left behind in a fair and balanced way. That's the way I see VOA.
If President Trump called you and said, "Michael, I saw you on 2A tonight, and I understand the importance of counteracting America's enemies around the world and inspiring voices for freedom, but Michael, we got to save the taxpayers' money, and we can't have the government being in the business of journalism. That doesn't make any sense." How would you answer him?
Well, I would say that I think my basic message these days, and by the way, this has been consistent since I took over. I don't believe this is a nice to have. I think this is a critical national security imperative for the United States, right? I remember talking to a senior person in the Biden administration when I took this job, and he was expressing a lot of concern because China and Russia had this kind of top-down, highly integrated, highly strategic, highly synthetic, basically information strategy, right? And their strategy is focused on disinformation, propaganda, lies, but they're very effective at it. And what you see in important parts of Latin America, Africa, you see Russia and China really getting a toehold in the media. And that's bad because they're spreading anti-American narratives. So my feeling, honestly, is if VOA didn't exist, it would have to be reinvented because it's important to counteract those narratives. And I don't see the private sector media doing it. So I would say, with respect, let's sit down. Let's, number one, think about what your most important foreign policy priorities are, right? If you want to focus on Iran, if you want to focus on China, let's look at how accurate information, unbiased, objective news. I think one important thing, Mark, about VOA, I'm not saying there's not a role in government for propaganda or for narrative building, and that should come from the State Department or the White House. I think there's a role for an independent, objective news organization, because, by the way, there's a high level of trust for VOA around the world. We just did a survey of our programs in Ukraine. 99% of Ukrainians trust VOA. That's an incredible statistic. And that is far different than most media and other people. People come to VOA because they know they're going to get something that they don't get from state-controlled media in their own countries.
Amber Duke is here. She writes for the Daily Caller. And Amber, great to have you here. Question for Michael.
Absolutely. So I'd love to just follow up on what Mark was talking about with that headline about white privilege. Voice of America recently came under fire as well for a directive from one of your editors saying that Hamas should not be referred to as a terrorist group without using quotes because they were not supposed to demonize that group. Now, it is official U.S. policy that Hamas is considered a foreign terrorist organization. So where is the disconnect between that editor's directive and your insistence that Voice of America is basically meant to promote the American foreign policy line abroad?
Right. So let me just say, first of all, Voice of America journalists regularly describe Hamas as terrorists. That is not an issue. I've made that clear. that they can be described as terrorists, because they are terrorists. That's what Hamas is. They're a terrorist group. Sometimes VOA reporters use a formulation, designated by the United States as a terrorist group, which might be appropriate in certain stories. But there was, before I got to VOA, a directive. It wasn't really a directive, but there was, what we have in VOA is a editor who kind of polices standards. I'm just being open with you. The editor, who's a very good editor, said something in an email to the staff, which really didn't really reflect what the official policy was. We tried to correct it, and that mistake, I think, has been killing us since then. But Hamas are terrorists, full stop.
I'm not sure what happened to Mark, so I'll go ahead and ask another question.
I'm right here. But go ahead,
Okay, great.
Ask
Yeah, sure. The other one I had was that there were several Voice of America reporters who in 2019, when Trump was still the president, were on their professional Twitter accounts tweeting about how much they disliked the president and how they had these disagreements with him. He was a threat to democracy, things of that nature. So it just seems like there's a lot of evidence in the past 5 years of Voice of America leaning in one direction. And that's one of the reasons why people feel uncomfortable with their taxpayer dollars going to your venture.
Well, look, Amber, with respect, that episode was 5 years ago. By the way, I think it's totally inappropriate, and I've made it clear to reporters since I've been at VOA, which has been for 9 months. I think it's totally inappropriate for any reporter, whoever the president is, whatever administration, to be advertising their personal opinions, political opinions, on social media. Because to me, and we have a clear social media policy that prohibits that. And in fact, we have a process by which people get disciplined for that, for egregious violations. There's a First Amendment in the country, which I want to respect, but there's also a standards issue that if people come to work for VOA or any news organization, like if you're at the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fox News, wherever, I don't think it's appropriate personally for reporters to be talking about, especially if you're covering the White House. Look, you can't control people's beliefs, right? People believe what they believe, and people bring that. But when you're good journalists, you check you check your biases at the door, and you don't do anything that would call into question your objectivity. So that's the way it's been at VOA since I've been there. I think there's a widespread agreement on that, and I think honestly, the VOA reporters, by and large, are very strong on being balanced and objective. Can you find exceptions to that? Of course you can. And one thing that VOA I've experienced is very good in my time is that when they see a mistake or they see an error of a lapse in standards, they correct it. That's really, every news organization does that. And I honestly, I'm not trying to say everything's perfect, but I think VOA, in terms of the balance issue, is pretty good, and I would defend it.
Amber, besides the kind of things you pointed out, which lots of people have problems with, do you like the mission of VOA historically? Do you think it's an important function to counter information in places like Iran and China, or you'd like to see it abolished, not based on the examples you cited, but based on the mission?
One thing that I have concerns about it, and Michael, you could probably address this as well, is what is the relationship between VOA and groups like the CIA and the FBI? How officially are you connected to the US intelligence community?
There's no connection. We're independent. In fact, we operate under a law that dates back to 1976, which says that the Secretary of State and the CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media should respect the editorial integrity of VOA. I think the only area where we interact with law enforcement is really on I guess two issues. One is background checks for people who come to work at VOA. I mean, this is a big issue, making sure that people adhere, don't have problems, don't have, connections to foreign intelligence services. I mean, like, if you're hiring a global audience, I mean, I'm sorry, if you're hiring a global workforce that comes from these countries, you got to be careful. And that is a very serious issue that I took very seriously. I ordered when I was at VOA heightened background investigation. I asked for heightened background investigations from USAGM for our journalists, and so I think that's a really legitimate thing. But there's not, other than that, there's not really any kind of law enforcement connection.
Adam, thank you for your patience. I'm going to turn Michael over to you in a minute, but Amber, I just want to press you a little bit in a friendly way. Leaving aside concerns of the kind you've raised, do you think that the government should have an arm that produces information in the applicable languages for, say, Iran and China to try to get information in there, or you don't think that's a taxpayer-worthy function?
I'm kind of split on that, to be honest with you, Mark, because I think there is an argument to be made that having an information arm of the government to make sure American values are being appropriately communicated throughout the world, but there's also just a general sort of negative reaction to the idea of propaganda. So that's
Yeah.
where I kind of sit on this.
Thank you, Amber. Adam, thank you again for your patience. Questions for Michael, please.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, just broadly, I think it's easy to press Michael on specific headlines, but I think that the US or the mission of Voice of America seems pretty noble. It seems like they have a diverse amount of viewpoints, which kind of represents the voices within America. There are diverse sectors of people who do believe in white privilege. I'm sure there are articles on the other side as well. I mean, it's just reflecting American values, but what people in America think. I think that, yeah, while the mission is noble, it kind of reminds me of the conversation we had last time I was on your show. What was the guy's name? He was smoking a cigar on his boat.
Alex Castellanos.
Alex, yeah, sorry, I should know that. Probably
That's okay.
disrespectful.
All good.
But he was
All
saying
good.
that Elon Musk is currently and Donald Trump are currently doing surgery on the government, and sometimes some tissue has to come out. And I was actually thinking about that, and I was thinking, isn't surgery rather precise? Wouldn't it be more precise to come to Michael himself and ask, hey, can you give us receipts on who you're paying, what you're doing, what your operations are, and we'll cut down and make sure that you're more efficient. But instead, it seems like they're kind of just nuking the entire agency, which in my opinion seems to be too far. And it seems to be indicative of Donald Trump's slash and burn method of tearing down agencies when there's probably a better way to do it. I mean, with the NIH, for example, you could ask for the head of these agencies at the NIH to report back with certain receipts or their payments, but it seems like they're just kind of going in with a chainsaw, literally running around with a chainsaw on stage. So any questions to Michael? Not really, no.
Okay. Thank you, Adam. We want to get your questions on this topic. So if your hand's up, I'm expecting right now, at least you'll ask a question about VOA. If you've got questions about other stuff, you can lower your hand for now, and we'll bring you back in a minute. A little bit of news before I start going to the community. President Trump on Truth Social just said he is pulling the Secret Service details for both Hunter and Ashley Biden. And he had various reasons for that that he gave, but that'll be quite a topic over the next few news cycles, I think. All right, let's start with Matthew Bartlett, who has a history in dealing with these here. Explain to folks your connection to American foreign policy and question for Michael, Adam, and Amber after you unmute. Go ahead. Go ahead, Matthew. Go ahead and unmute.
Hey, I think
One more time.
okay. I think you can hear me now. Thank you
There you
so
go.
much. Served at the
Yes.
State Department. I was the communications director for the Educational and Cultural Affairs Bureau. We had quite a bit of, I guess you could call interaction with VOA. And Michael, boy, 9 months. It sounds like you are the right person to head VOA. I applaud everything that you have said because what you've said is in America's strategic interest. But if I'm being candid, the reality that we, at least, or perception that was our reality, was that VOA was quite the opposite, and it was propaganda against the U.S. That it was telling bad narratives around the United States. We could not get a good VOA story, and the question is, why are we the taxpayer paying for anti-US propaganda around the world. So that was, what we faced.
Matthew, what's an example of something that you saw that you considered anti-US propaganda?
Gosh, this is about 4 years ago. I would just say we were always, poised for VOA because the questions and the coverage seemed to not just have a, left-leaning bias, but an anti-US bias. And as the Trump administration, it was always problematic with VOA. Again, the mission that you articulated seemed to be, advancing American interests would be welcomed, but we felt as if the reality of it was advancing. You talked about China, you talked about Iran, you talk about anti-American sentiment, and that VOA was very unfortunately, many of their reporters were putting in their own ideology, their own footprint, and this was something that was backfiring. So again, that was where we were coming from, recognizing
Right.
that you've been there for 9 months.
Okay, I know you said it's been a long time. You can't think of a specific. I'll just say before we turn it to Michael, it's difficult to me to respond to that without any specifics. But Michael, I have heard that not just from Matthew, but from other Republicans and not just from Trump Republicans. So what would you say to that?
It's hard to react to like a general accusation. And I think it's hard to overstate the amount of news that VOA produces every day. We have a Tibet service, a Bambara service, a French to Africa service, a Spanish to Latin America service. We produce hundreds and hundreds of stories and videos and texts. And, I'm not saying we get it from the other side too. But it's striking to me that when VOA was shuttered over the weekend, that the national security rivals of the United States in China and Iran were happy. They were happy because basically the United States, in their view, was shuttering the news that they want to prevent their people from accessing. So, I'll give you a story. One of my big priorities at VOA in my short months was to really try to elevate and improve our China coverage. That's a really important issue. And one of the things that we often did on VOA, there's a huge appetite in China for really talk and conversation, kind of like this, on topics of public affairs. So when we do, like, we had a guy from Harvard who was an economist talking for an hour and a half in a very lucid way about the Chinese economy. We had a person from the Trump campaign and a person from the Biden campaign, debating in Chinese, in Mandarin, the foreign policy of Biden and Trump. That's not something that Chinese citizens get, and that is VOA at its best. And honestly, VOA is a huge brand. I always think about the head of our China team who was at Tiananmen Square. She was inspired because during that revolution, the only way that the Chinese people got accurate, the students got accurate information on what was going on in Tiananmen Square, was they took down they handwrit the VOA broadcasts that were coming in by radio, and they spread it around, by paper. And that inspired her. And she came to America because she really had her name is Xin Chen, and she really wanted to make a difference in journalism. And she came to VOA, and she is right now really focusing the China division on exposing China's human rights violation, explaining America to China in a fair way. It's really something that I really believe in the mission. I also believe that by and large, our reporters do it well. Are there mistakes? Is there bias? Of course, but I'm not going. But I don't think. I think that it's easy to take isolated examples and make a bigger story out of this. I truly think that if we shut down VOA, it's going to be a self-inflicted wound. And I'm not saying that VOA has to be exactly the way it is. I would be in favor of a radical, rethinking about how the news is operated. It can be definitely more digital. There's lots of things that can be done. And, I think that the VOA staff would be very open to working with the new Trump administration on that. They have a history of basically, taking direction from whatever administration happens to be in power. And so I just think rather than this kind of, indiscriminate cutting, I think it would have been better if the whole thing had been reviewed carefully with an identification of strategic priorities, then figure out a plan to get there. I know that's not the way this administration has tended to do things, but that's the way I think it would have been better. I mean, I've been at VOA for 8 or 9 months. I still feel I don't know the institution that well, and it's a big institution and complicated.
Matthew, thank you. Michael, we kept you a little bit longer than we had discussed, so I want to thank you for being part of the conversation. And as this goes forward, I hope you'll come back and share with folks your thoughts about how this evolves.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your great audience. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Great to see you.